Number 1. Jennifer Sweeney was in her late 30s when police said she turned from girlfriend to murderer. Living in Tinton Falls, New Jersey, she worked a series of jobs and moved in circles that included a social club for motorcycle enthusiasts known as the Rough Riders. Friends once saw a confident woman with a wide smile, devoted to her partner, Tarita Julius, a mother from Linden who was a few years older. But beneath that public image, prosecutors later argued, Sweeney's life revolved around control and suspicion, checking a shared phone plan to monitor calls and messages as the relationship frayed. By late autumn of 2015, their romance had soured. Investigators would say jealousy and fear of being left were accelerating forces, evidenced by angry confrontations and the way Sweeney tracked Julius's contacts. Witnesses recalled seeing Sweeney visibly upset when Julius danced with another person at a club event. In statements aired in court, detectives described a pattern: monitoring, confrontation, then planning. These were signposts, prosecutors argued, of a looming act of violence rather than an isolated explosion. The first attempt came in late November of that year on a Linden Street. Julia sat in a car outside her home, preparing to go to her son's basketball game, when a gunman opened fire. Julius and her teenage daughter were hit, yet Julius managed to drive away and survive after a long hospitalization. According to authorities, Sweeney had enlisted a longtime acquaintance, Andre Harris, to carry out the ambush. When Julius recovered, she returned to her routine with limited mobility and lingering fear. A few months later, in early March of 2016, Julius vanished after spending time in the shore town of Long Branch. For nearly 5 months, her family searched and pleaded for answers. In mid-August, detectives digging behind Harris's Long Branch home uncovered Julius's body, buried in the yard. The investigation tightened quickly. Cell phone records, witness accounts, and Sweeney's inconsistent statements drew scrutiny. Prosecutors said the failed shooting was followed by a fatal confrontation in which Sweeney strangled Julius and then helped hide the body on Harris's property. Both were arrested. A Monmouth County grand jury later indicted them. During Sweeney's trial, jurors heard about phone monitoring, jealousy over a new relationship, and a series of steps that prosecutors called deliberate and sustained. In early September of 2021, a jury found Sweeney guilty of murder, attempted murder, conspiracy, and related offenses. At sentencing in early May of 2022, a Superior Court judge imposed a prison term totaling 95 years, reflecting the murder, the earlier attempt, and other counts. News outlets reported the courtroom packed, the judge calling the scheme cold-hearted and prolonged. Under New Jersey's No Early Release Act, officials said Sweeney would be required to serve at least 85% of the sentence before parole eligibility. The victim's family addressed the court with grief and relief that the search for truth had ended. As for motive, prosecutors centered on jealousy and control, fear that Julius was moving on, anger at perceived infidelity, and an insistence on tracking her communications. The case narrative aligned with an obsessive pattern rather than a sudden break, a view supported by the earlier ambush and by Sweeney's behavior in the months that followed. Defense counsel maintained that Sweeney loved Julius and denied the accusations, but the jury rejected those claims. In late May of 2024, an appellate panel affirmed Sweeney's convictions but ordered a resentencing on specific legal grounds, leaving the underlying verdict intact. She remains incarcerated in New Jersey state custody, while the case continues through the post-trial process. Number 2. Sherry Lee Hefernon was a 57-year-old real estate agent from Pennsylvania when prosecutors said a family dispute turned deadly on the Jersey Shore. To neighbors, she was capable and driven, a woman who knew the coastal market and visited Long Beach Island often to see her father, John Jack Enders, a retired businessman who shared an oceanfront home with his partner, Françoise Frenchy Pitois. The family history was complicated. Court records later described frayed relationships, arguments about money, and tension over whether the beach house should be sold and who would benefit from it. That domestic strain formed the backdrop to what would follow. In the months leading up to the killings, relatives and investigators recounted escalating conflict. Heffernan learned she had been removed from her father's estate plans, a decision that, according to prosecutors, left her furious and determined to reclaim control. Interviews and filings referenced estrangement among siblings and repeated arguments about the property, a prized symbol of the family's past summers and a source of present-day resentment. Those pressures, coupled with a failing relationship with her father, were presented as the emotional trigger, loss of status, perceived betrayal, and a fixation on the house as both grievance and prize. Just before dawn in late September of 2021, a figure in a rain jacket was captured on neighborhood security cameras near the Surf City residence. The footage showed a large recreational vehicle arriving and departing around daybreak. Prosecutors said the vehicle matched one owned by Hefernon. Inside the home, investigators would later determine the attack began while Enders and Petoy were asleep. Authorities told jurors that both victims were shot and then repeatedly stabbed. The description was clinical and direct, but the emphasis at trial was on planning and intent rather than graphic detail. The victims were an elderly couple who knew their attacker well, and the setting of familiar living room by the water added a haunting intimacy to the crime. Detectives tied the case together through technology and shoe leather work, surveillance images, cell phone location data, travel records, and footprints inside the house. Hefernon returned to Pennsylvania and was arrested soon afterward. She pleaded not guilty and maintained her innocence. A jury in Ocean County ultimately convicted her of 2 counts of murder and of weapons offenses. At sentencing in May of 2024, a Superior Court judge called the killings exceptionally depraved and imposed 2 consecutive life terms. In the courtroom, members of both families spoke through tears about the people they had lost, a devoted grandfather and a mother who brightened every room. Hefernon addressed the judge as well, saying she mourned the victims and insisting the system had gotten it wrong. Psychologically, prosecutors framed the motive as a combustible mix of anger and entitlement, being cut out of the will, feeling excluded from decisions about the beloved shore house, and a determination to reverse that humiliation. That theory was reinforced by estate documents and testimony about recent disputes. While Heffernon's defense argued there was reasonable doubt and pointed away from her, jurors accepted the state's narrative of deliberate planning and close-range violence carried out inside a family home. There was no formal psychiatric diagnosis presented to the public, but the state's portrait suggested a person narrowing her world to a single grievance until it eclipsed empathy, reason, and the ties that once held the family together. Hefernon is serving 2 consecutive life sentences in New Jersey State Prison following her 2024 conviction and sentencing. Number 3. Michelle Lodzinski was 23 years old, a young single mother from South Amboy, New Jersey, working office and service jobs while raising her kindergarten-age son, Timothy Wiltsey. Friends remembered a quiet woman who kept a small circle and leaned on family for childcare. In late spring of the early 1990s, she told neighbors she planned to take Timothy to a local carnival at Kennedy Park in nearby Sayreville, a simple outing at the start of the holiday weekend. That ordinary plan became the center of a case that would shadow her life for decades. The stresses around Lodzinski were typical of early adulthood money pressures, rotating work, and a complicated romantic life, but investigators later focused on something else, a series of inconsistent statements she gave in the days after her son vanished. Detectives documented shifts in her account of when and how she last saw Timothy, details that, to them, suggested confusion at best and deception at worst. Those doubts hardened over time as the case went cold, even though grief and shock can also fracture memory and demeanor. On a warm Saturday evening in late May of 1991, Lodzinski reported that Timothy had disappeared at the carnival. Police shut down the grounds and launched an overnight search with officers, firefighters, and volunteers. Months passed with no answers. In late April of 1992, skeletal remains were discovered across the Raritan River in Edison, near an office park where Lodzinski had once worked. The remains were identified as Timothy's. The cause of death could not be determined due to decomposition. Nearby, investigators recovered a blue blanket and pillowcase that at the time yielded no forensic link to the family. For years, the file sat unresolved. In the early 2010s, a county investigator reopened the case and re-examined the blanket. Former babysitters, including an estranged niece, told authorities they recognized it from Lodzinski's apartment when Timothy was alive. There was no DNA tying the blanket to Lodzinski, but prosecutors argued the identification undercut her account that she had lost the boy at the carnival. In the summer of 2014, Lodzinski, then living in Florida with 2 younger children, was charged with murder and extradited to New Jersey. After an 8-week trial in the spring of 2016, a Middlesex County jury found her guilty of first-degree murder based entirely on circumstantial evidence. The judge imposed a 30-year sentence without the possibility of parole, the mandatory minimum for that offense at the time. News coverage captured a divided public response. Some saw overdue accountability. Others worried that the evidence, the inconsistent statements, and the disputed blanket did not prove intent beyond a reasonable doubt. Appeals followed. In late December of 2021, the New Jersey Supreme Court, in a narrow decision, vacated Lodzinski's conviction, ruling that the state had not presented enough evidence for a reasonable jury to find that she purposely caused her son's death. Hours later, she was released from the Edna Mahan Correctional Facility. The ruling emphasized the absence of direct forensic proof and the indeterminate cause of death, even as it acknowledged the troubling gaps in her story. Families connected to Timothy expressed anguish. Defense advocates called the decision a necessary guardrail against convictions based on speculation. Prosecutors had portrayed Lodzinski as overwhelmed and eager to reclaim her independence, while the defense insisted she was a scapegoat of a tragic disappearance that could not be fully explained. No formal psychological diagnosis was offered publicly, and experts have continued to debate how much weight to give demeanor and memory shifts under trauma. Michelle Lodzinski now lives in Florida. Under double jeopardy protections, she cannot be tried again for Timothy Wiltsey's death. Number 4. Kathleen Dorset was 36 years old, a preschool teacher from Neptune Township, New Jersey, when a turbulent divorce and a bitter custody fight with her ex-husband, Stephen Moore, turned her life into a criminal case that shocked Monmouth County. Colleagues described her as organized and attentive with young children, and her family image seemed close-knit. Kathleen lived near her parents, Thomas and Leslie Dorset, and relied on them for help with her toddler daughter. But beneath that stable picture, court records later showed a home consumed by disputes over parenting schedules, child support, and where their little girl would be raised. As the separation dragged on, pressure mounted. Prosecutors said the Dorsets became increasingly angry about the custody arrangement and the financial obligations tied to it. Testimony and plea hearings painted a portrait of a family convinced that Stephen's presence stood in the way of the future they wanted for Kathleen and the child. That belief, according to investigators, hardened into planning. Discussions about surveillance, moves to control pickup and drop-off times, and talk of removing obstacles rather than working through the court system. On a summer morning in mid-August of 2010, Stephen arrived at the Dorset home in the Oakhurst section of Ocean Township to return his 18-month-old daughter after a scheduled visit. What happened next unfolded in the most familiar of places, a backyard he had walked into many times. In her later court statements, Kathleen acknowledged luring Stephen toward the rear of the house, where her father was waiting. Moments later, Stephen was attacked and strangled. Investigators said the body was moved into a vehicle and, in a further attempt to erase the crime, the victim's car was set ablaze in nearby Long Branch. Stephen's colleagues reported him missing when he failed to appear at work, and within days, police discovered his remains in the burned car, turning a missing person call into a homicide investigation. Detectives followed a trail of practical clues, phone records, surveillance footage, and contradictions in interviews. The investigation soon widened to the entire family. Court filings later revealed that Leslie Dorset discussed paying an undercover officer, who she believed was a hired killer, to harm Stephen's mother, a desperate attempt, prosecutors said, to silence a grieving parent who was pressing for answers. Meanwhile, Thomas Dorset sought help to torch the car before doing it himself. Those plots, recorded and corroborated by law enforcement, became some of the most chilling evidence of calculated thinking beyond the initial killing. In the spring of 2013, facing a trial, all 3 Dorsets entered guilty pleas. Kathleen admitted to murder and related charges, telling the judge she had steered Stephen into the backyard where her father lay in wait. Thomas pleaded guilty to murder and arson. Leslie pleaded guilty to conspiracy in the murder for hire plan. That summer, a Superior Court judge imposed lengthy sentences, calling the case an American family tragedy. 58 years for Kathleen, with a substantial period of parole ineligibility under New Jersey's No Early Release Act. 45 years for Thomas and 7 years for Leslie. Reporters in the courtroom described the victim's family speaking through tears about a devoted son and father whose life had been reduced to case files and exhibits. Experts who have discussed the case publicly frame the motive as a volatile blend of anger, entitlement, and fear of losing control over a child's future, a grievance that, in this telling, narrowed until violence was treated as a solution. Appellate decisions recount Kathleen's acknowledgement of her role and the plea agreement terms, and they note the statutory requirement that a large portion of her sentence be served before any parole consideration. Kathleen Dorset is imprisoned at the Edna Mahan Correctional Facility, serving a 58-year sentence and facing an extended parole-ineligible period mandated by state law. Number 5. Melanie Lynn McGuire was in her early 30s, a registered nurse at a fertility clinic in Morristown, New Jersey, married to William Bill McGuire, a computer programmer and adjunct instructor. Friends saw a capable professional juggling long shifts and motherhood. The couple had 2 young sons and had just closed on a new house, a milestone that should have signaled stability. But beneath the surface, prosecutors later said the marriage was strained, and Melanie was secretly involved with a physician from her workplace, a hidden life that would loom large once Bill disappeared. In the weeks before Bill went missing, investigators would later testify that Melanie's stressors were mounting: a failing relationship at home, an affair she seemed intent on pursuing, and internet searches that pointed to planning rather than panic. According to trial evidence, she researched topics that included how to commit murder, undetectable poisons, and the sedative chloral hydrate. She then filled a forged prescription for that drug. 2 days before Bill was last seen, she purchased a .38 caliber revolver and ammunition in Pennsylvania. Prosecutors framed these steps as an escalation from marital discord to methodical preparation. Bill vanished around late April of 2004, shortly after the couple finalized the home purchase. In the first half of May, along the Virginia coast near the Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel, authorities recovered 3 matching suitcases containing his remains. The grisly headlines traveled fast, and the nickname "suitcase murder" attached to the case. But at trial, the emphasis stayed on sequence and intent. The state argued that Bill had been drugged and shot in the couple's Woodbridge apartment, and that the suitcases were an attempt to conceal the crime and distance it from New Jersey. Detectives built their case through a mosaic of evidence. The gun purchase was documented by a sales receipt and testimony. Forensic analysts connected trash bags used to wrap the remains to bags from the McGuire home. Tape on the bags carried microscopic material with mixed DNA from both spouses. Investigators also learned Melanie drove Bill's car to Atlantic City and abandoned it. Fearing a surveillance image might expose her, she admitted the parking maneuver in a call a friend recorded for police. Each piece, the state argued, undercut her public claim that Bill had angrily stormed off and never returned. Nearly 3 years after the discovery, a jury in Middlesex County found Melanie McGuire guilty of first-degree murder and related charges, including desecration of human remains, possession of a weapon for an unlawful purpose, and perjury tied to her sworn statement in family court. In mid-July of 2007, a Superior Court judge imposed life imprisonment, with additional time for perjury served consecutively. Under New Jersey's No Early Release Act, authorities calculated that she must serve more than 6 decades before becoming eligible for parole. Appeals that followed in the next several years left the conviction and sentence intact. As for motive, prosecutors described a convergence of desire and opportunity, a marriage in collapse, a plan to start fresh with a lover, financial and custody complications, and a trail of actions that, in their view, demonstrated deliberate intent. Defense teams challenged the state's narrative, stressing the absence of the firearm and questioning parts of the forensic picture. Later interviews from prison show Melanie continuing to proclaim innocence. Yet, appellate opinions repeatedly concluded the evidence was sufficient for the verdict a reasonable jury reached. Melanie McGuire is serving a life sentence at the Edna Mahan Correctional Facility in New Jersey, with parole eligibility calculated far in the future under state law. Number 6. Celestine Payne was a Patterson matriarch in her early 50s when police and prosecutors said she engineered a cold calculus around life insurance and trust. She lived in a busy household where tenants came and went, her adult children orbited close, and friends of the family treated her kitchen as a second home. To neighbors, she could seem generous and in charge, the kind of woman who loaned a casserole dish and asked about your day. But behind that image, investigators later described a pattern of manipulation: who was on which policy, who obeyed her instructions, and who could be persuaded to do what she wanted. The pressures in her world were not the usual bills and disagreements. According to court records summarized by reporters, Celestine's triggers were opportunity and control, the idea that a piece of paper with her name on it could turn relationships into payouts. Over several years in the early 1990s, Authorities said she tested boundaries and escalated. She pressured vulnerable people to sign documents they did not understand, played on loyalty, and exploited the intimacy of family ties. When others hesitated, she sowed lies to push them forward. The picture that emerged was not of sudden rage, but of deliberate planning over time. The first death came in the early 1990s. Prosecutors said she poisoned her husband, Alfonso Payne, to collect life insurance, then used family members to help hide his body in a box by the side of a road. 2 years later, she turned to a tenant, Eugene Cooper, a man on the autism spectrum who trusted her. She urged him to take out a policy, naming her as beneficiary, then recruited her daughter's boyfriend, Charles Pincham, with the promise of money. Cooper was stabbed and left on a Patterson Street, but he survived and reached a hospital. There, Celestine posed as his mother and signed a do not resuscitate order, an audacious step that investigators later cited as proof of intent. The plan failed. Cooper lived. By the mid-1990s, Celestine had widened the circle. She convinced her daughter to impersonate a teenage friend, Tara Carter, to secure another policy that listed Celestine as beneficiary. When Tara, who had long called Celestine aunt, prepared to leave the house and start fresh, the scheme turned deadly. On an early March morning in the mid-1990s, joggers in Eastside Park discovered a body wrapped inside a sleeping bag. Detectives traced the victim to Tara, then to the Payne home, where they noticed stains consistent with a cleanup and found insurance paperwork that did not add up. Questioning led to Pincham, who told investigators he had been prompted to attack, describing how Celestine handed him a crowbar and signaled that the moment had come. The investigation knit together threads from years of wrongdoing, the husband's death for roughly $39,000 in insurance, the attempted murder of Cooper after promises of around $60,000, the fraudulent policy tied to Tara, and the discovery of a body in a public park. As detectives confronted one participant after another, confessions followed, and the pattern became harder to deny. In the late 1990s, Celestine Payne pleaded guilty to 2 counts of murder and additional charges. A judge in Passaic County imposed 2 life terms to run at the same time. The case drew local outrage not only for the deaths, but for the way trust had been weaponized inside a family home. Experts and courts later described a psychology of instrumentalization, people seen not as loved ones but as vehicles to solve problems and generate cash. The New Jersey Supreme Court, reviewing her petition for compassionate release decades later, emphasized a sustained course of conduct marked by calculation and deception. Doctors who evaluated her in prison noted compliant behavior and low risk, but the justices concluded that the extraordinary cruelty of the crimes outweighed those considerations. Celestine Payne remains incarcerated at the Edna Mahan Correctional Facility. She is serving concurrent life sentences and, according to court summaries, becomes eligible for parole in March of 2025. Number 7. Leslie Ann Nelson was 37 years old when officers arrived at her parents' home in Haddon Heights, New Jersey, to serve a search warrant. Neighbors knew Nelson as private and intense, a person who mostly kept to herself and struggled to find steady work. She identified as a transgender woman and was living with her aging parents on a quiet, tree-lined street. To outsiders, the house appeared calm. Inside, investigators would later say, Nelson feared scrutiny over weapons she kept in her upstairs bedroom and was deeply upset by a child abuse allegation that had brought authorities to the door earlier that day. The emotional temperature rose quickly. According to court records, Nelson had been told that the abuse inquiry would continue and that her room might be searched for firearms. Witnesses later described her as distraught and volatile, worried about what police would find and angry about the accusation. Prosecutors painted a picture of a person under mounting stress, with depression and isolation narrowing her options until she saw confrontation as the only path. That combination, fear of exposure, mental strain, and ready access to a rifle became the fuse for what followed. On the morning of Thursday, April 20th, in the mid-1990s, Camden County investigator John Jack McLaughlin and Haddon Heights officer John Norcross returned to the Sylvan Drive home with a warrant. A third officer, Detective Richard Norcross, accompanied them. Inside the narrow hallway upstairs, gunfire erupted. McLaughlin and John Norcross were fatally shot, and Richard Norcross was critically wounded. The neighborhood was locked down as Nelson barricaded herself, touching off a standoff that stretched through the day and into the night before she surrendered. The killings shattered a small borough where residents knew the officers by name, and held impromptu vigils on their porches. Detectives reconstructed the sequence through ballistics, witness accounts, and the officers' radios. The warrant, the return to the house, and the ambush in the upstairs hallway formed the spine of the case. In statements read in court, surviving witnesses described scenes of chaos as neighbors were escorted to safety and additional officers rushed in. Within days, the Camden County Prosecutor's Office publicly identified the fallen and laid out the charges. As the legal process began, the funerals drew long processions of patrol cars and black-banded badges from across the region. Nelson ultimately entered guilty pleas to the murders of Investigator McLaughlin and Officer John Norcross, and to the aggravated assault of Detective Richard Norcross. Over years of litigation, including appellate rulings on penalty issues, the case moved toward a final outcome that rejected execution and imposed lengthy incarceration. The sentence that stands today is 2 life terms to be served, one after the other, with significant periods that must be served before any parole consideration, plus a consecutive term for the wounding of Richard Norcross. Courts later summarized that each life term carried a substantial parole-ineligible minimum, and that the additional sentence reflected the grievous injury to the surviving officer. Public reaction remained raw. Ceremonies on anniversaries of the shooting honored the officers and recommitted local departments to their work. Psychologically, prosecutors and local officials have described Nelson as a person in crisis whose anger and fear met the presence of a high-powered rifle in a confined space. Reporting at the time referenced depression and social isolation. The legal record emphasized the deliberate act of opening fire on officers lawfully present with a warrant. That duality, mental strain alongside purposeful action, framed how courts and the public interpreted the crime and the punishment that followed. Memorial statements from law enforcement continue to focus on duty and loss rather than motive, while acknowledging the complicated personal history behind the case. Leslie Ann Nelson is incarcerated at the Edna Mahan Correctional Facility for Women, serving consecutive life sentences. According to public records, she is eligible for parole in late February of 2048. Number 8. Maria Montalvo was 29 years old, a young mother living in Monmouth County, when a family dispute and deepening emotional turmoil spiraled into tragedy in Freehold. Relatives and neighbors knew her as quiet and private. She had married into a large Puerto Rican family and was raising 2 toddlers, a son named Raphael and a daughter named Zonaida. On an ordinary weekday, she drove the children to her in-laws' home, a place that should have meant safety, where grandparents often helped with childcare. That driveway would become the center of a case that stunned New Jersey and sent shockwaves far beyond the county line. In the days leading up to the fire, investigators later learned that Montalvo and her husband had argued and that she seemed overwhelmed. Prosecutors told reporters she might have been suicidal, a detail that framed the state's understanding of her mental state without offering a formal diagnosis. Those who saw her that week described a woman under strained sleep-starved, worried about her marriage, and struggling to find calm. The portrait that emerged after the fact was of a young parent at a breaking point, not of a person with a documented history of violence. On the afternoon of Tuesday, February 22nd of 1994, Montalvo pulled into the in-laws' driveway with Raphael, about 28 months old, and Zonaida, about 18 months old, strapped in the back seat. Authorities said she had purchased gasoline as she made the drive. Within moments, flames and thick smoke took hold. Neighbors and family members rushed toward the car. Witnesses later recounted that Montalvo was pulled away from the open driver's door with her coat on fire, while frantic attempts to open the rear doors failed. The blaze grew into a fireball that could be seen from the street. Both children died at the scene. The images of a family's home-turned disaster zone would linger in the public memory long after the sirens faded. Police and prosecutors quickly treated the case as a crime. That night, Montalvo was charged with 2 counts of murder and 1 count of aggravated arson. The Monmouth County Prosecutor's Office outlined the early evidence: the recent argument at home, the gasoline purchase, and the decision to set the fire while the children were trapped in their seats. Reporters who covered the aftermath noted the stunned quiet that fell over the block once the emergency crews left, and the way family members alternated between anger and disbelief as investigators sealed the driveway with yellow tape. The case moved to Superior Court in Freehold, where the charges would be tested in the years that followed. At trial, the state argued that Montalvo acted with purpose and tried to stage the scene as a desperate outburst rather than a deliberate act. The facts, they said, spoke for themselves: the purchase of fuel, the location, and the speed with which the car ignited. There was no graphic forensic display for jurors. The medical findings were described in restrained, clinical terms, but the pattern and sequence carried the weight of the evidence. The defense emphasized her fragile state of mind and the chaos of the moment, but the jury sided with prosecutors. In the mid-1990s, she was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Psychologically, the official narrative centered on acute emotional collapse, a young mother in distress, spiraling after marital conflict, whose despair intersected with a catastrophic decision. Prosecutors publicly referenced suicidal ideation. No detailed mental health assessment was made part of the record available to the press. The community response was raw and immediate, with vigils for the children and pointed questions about how warning signs can be recognized before they harden into tragedy. Maria Montalvo is incarcerated at the Edna Mahan Correctional Facility for Women, serving a life sentence. Number 9. Marie Moore was 35 years old, a single mother in Paterson, when neighbors began calling her the cool mom, the woman who let kids hang out, piled them into her car for trips to the boardwalk, and offered a place that felt freer than home. Among those children was her goddaughter, Teresa Fury, a quiet 12-year-old who trusted Moore enough to move in for stretches at a time. What seemed like a loose, lively household concealed something far darker. Behind the smiles and errands, prosecutors later said, Moore tightened her control over the kids in her orbit, demanding loyalty and obedience that went well beyond normal rules. Over months, tension inside the Madison Avenue apartment escalated. Court records describe a manipulator who used stories, fear, and humiliation to keep children compliant. Moore pushed a fantastical narrative that a powerful celebrity and shadowy enemies were watching, and cast herself as the only adult who could keep the group safe if they followed her orders exactly. The psychological pressure was constant: isolation from families, chores measured to the inch, punishments for perceived disloyalty, and a hierarchy that pitted one child against another. Experts later reading the file saw familiar elements of coercive control, love bombing, threats, and a closed world where the abuser defines reality. In the early 1980s, that closed world turned deadly. In late December of the year 1983, police searched an apartment Moore had occupied and found the partially mummified remains of Teresa Fury hidden behind a bedroom wall. The discovery revealed months of terror that other children survived to describe. They told investigators how rules hardened into torment, how Teresa became the focus of punishments, and how they feared that stepping out of line would make them the next target. The details were presented to jurors in restrained, clinical testimony, but the pattern was unmistakable: a trusted caregiver turning a home into a place of domination and harm. Detectives built the case through interviews with surviving children, medical findings, and the physical evidence from the apartment. A Passaic County grand jury returned a sprawling indictment that included capital murder and numerous counts involving other victims. In the autumn of the year 1984, a jury convicted Moore of the capital murder of Teresa Fury and sentenced her to death, making her the first woman in New Jersey to receive that punishment under the modern statute. Public reaction was stunned, a tight-knit city reckoning with the idea that a self-styled den mother had presided over cruelty in plain sight. On direct review, the New Jersey Supreme Court reversed the murder conviction and the death sentence, ruling that the trial judge failed to instruct jurors on diminished capacity and lesser-included offenses, and that the record did not support the finding that Moore killed by her own conduct as required for a capital verdict. The case returned to the trial court. Rather than risk another contested capital trial, prosecutors dropped the murder count and pursued the remaining charges. In the summer of the year 1989, Moore was resentenced on multiple counts of kidnapping and assault to a term totaling well over a century, effectively a life sentence many times over. Psychologically, the case file sketches a portrait of instrumental abuse: a caregiver who reframed affection as obedience, invented external threats, and used a chosen enforcer among the children to carry out punishments. Appellate opinions do not adopt a formal mental health diagnosis, but they emphasize the closed system of control, the constructed myths, and the way ordinary bonds, godparent, neighbor, friend, were exploited to isolate and dominate. The abiding lesson for investigators was how a charismatic adult can groom a circle of dependence until resistance seems impossible. Marie Moore's capital conviction was vacated. She later received a cumulative sentence of roughly 135 years on kidnapping and related counts. Public records indicate she was removed from active inmate rosters years later. No official public notice of her death has been issued. Number 10. Joanne Deborah Chesimard, better known as Assata Shakur, was in her mid-20s when she emerged as a member of the Black Liberation Army and a face of radical protest, and in her early 30s when a New Jersey jury said she was a killer. Born in New York City and raised between the city and North Carolina, she reinvented herself as Assata, she who struggles, while moving through campus activism into underground politics. To supporters, she was a poised, sharp-minded organizer who spoke about racism and state violence. To law enforcement, she was a fugitive tied to robberies, shootouts, and a growing militant network. In the years before the highway gunfire that defined her public life, pressure and paranoia were constant companions. Surveillance, arrests, and pending charges stacked up across several states. Friends described a life spent scanning for unmarked cars and knock-and-talk visits. Investigators, for their part, saw a determined cadre willing to use weapons to advance their cause. That collision ideology meeting fear of capture set the stage for what followed on a spring night in New Jersey. Just before midnight on Wednesday, May 2nd of 1973, troopers stopped a car on the New Jersey Turnpike near East Brunswick. Inside were Assata Shakur, Zaid Malik Shakur, and Sundiata Akoli. Within minutes, a stop turned chaotic. Gunfire tore through the darkness. When the echoes faded, Trooper Werner Forster was mortally wounded, Trooper James Harper injured, Zaid Shakur dead, and Assata Shakur herself shot and taken into custody on the roadway. The state said she fired the shots that killed Forster. She insisted her hands were raised and that she had already been hit when the trooper fell. 4 years later, in Middlesex County, jurors heard a case built on ballistics, trooper testimony, and a chain of earlier incidents the state used to frame motive and means. The defense countered with medical evidence about nerve damage and arm wounds, arguing she could not have fired in the way prosecutors described. In the end, the jury convicted her of murder and related offenses, and a judge imposed a life term along with additional sentences. The verdict drew starkly different reactions. Law enforcement circles called it justice for a fallen trooper, while activists denounced what they saw as a political prosecution. In early November of 1979, the story took its most cinematic turn. With help from associates, Shakur escaped from the Clinton Correctional Facility for Women, slipped into an underground network, and surfaced years later in Havana, where the Cuban government granted her asylum. In the decades that followed, New Jersey officials and the Federal Bureau of Investigation pressed for extradition, even placing her on the most wanted terrorist list in the early 2010s, as debates about her case reignited across generations. For investigators, the motive was straightforward: an armed revolutionary worldview that endorsed attacking police and resisting arrest at any cost. For her supporters, the psychology was different: a woman radicalized by racism, targeted by surveillance, and wounded during a stop that spiraled out of control. She spoke and wrote from exile about those beliefs, casting herself as a survivor of political repression. Whatever lens one chose, the human cost remained fixed: a trooper dead, families grieving, and a figure whose name could still split a room. Joanne Deborah Chesimard, known as Assata Shakur, died in Havana in late September of 2025 at the age of 78, according to Cuban officials and multiple news outlets.